All right, it is now noon, and so I think we can kick things off. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program with our guest speaker, Dr. Brandon Valeriano. Thanks to Dr. Valeriano and to everyone who's joined us online today. I'm Bill Reisinger, Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. I'm a member of the ICFRC's board and host for today's program. We would like to acknowledge and thank our annual donors, sponsors, and partners for their support. The Iowa Arts Council, through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program, Public Policy Center, and Center for Human Rights, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, and City Channel 4 for providing online access to all of ICFRC's programs, along with the UI library archives. As we get started, please identify where your video and audio mute and unmute buttons are located. Please mute your audio and video for the duration of the presentation so you do not interrupt the speaker during his remarks. Following our speaker's presentation at about 12:45 p.m., we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. It's now my pleasure to introduce Brandon Valeriano, who will speak about what do we know about cybersecurity, understanding Russian cyber aggression. Brandon Valeriano serves as a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Foreign and Defense Policy, and he is a distinguished senior fellow at the Marine Corps University. He was most recently the Donald Bren Chair of Military Innovation at the Marine Corps University at the Krulak Center and a senior advisor for the Cyber Solarium Commission. Dr. Valeriano has published 6 books and dozens of articles for such outlets as the Journal of Politics, International Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Peace Research. His 2 most recent books are Cyber War versus Cyber Reality from 2015 and Cyber Strategy 2018, both with Oxford University Press. He has provided testimony on cyber conflict before the United States Senate and the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Ongoing research explores conflict escalation, big data in cybersecurity, and repression in cyberspace. Dr. Valeriano is the area editor in international relations for the Journal of Cybersecurity and the series editor of Disruptive Technology and International Security for Oxford University Press. He has a PhD from Vanderbilt University. So it is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Valeriano to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council today. And Brandon, it's all yours.
Great. So thanks for having me. Someone just asked me a minute ago how the press front is going. And I just mentioned that we submitted something to the Washington Post this morning. So hopefully it'll run tomorrow or the next day. But while Bill was talking, I was also forwarding it to a reporter. But I think one thing to say about the conflict that's ongoing is that a lot of people are acting like they know and understand what's going on. And it's fairly dubious. And there's a lot of fog of war right now. There's a lot of confusion. But I think if you've been keeping up and you've been paying attention to the evolution of Russian military capabilities, a lot of what I say isn't going to be very surprising. But for some people it is, because a lot of people like to inflate threats and inflate myths that there is this big bad adversary out there who's looking to get us. And that can't be any more clear given what Putin and Russia have been doing over this last week, or I think we're on day 7 now. But if you want to take it to the slice of research that I focus on, which is technology and international security, we've seen enormous Russian failures on this front. And it just demonstrates something I said in 2015, that Putin is a paper tiger. He can take over small countries, he can cause massive civilian death. But it's very clear that if he were to fight a peer adversary, well, one, I don't even think there are peer adversaries really in NATO at this point, because their capabilities vastly outweigh Russian capabilities. In any case, I'll just get to the presentation, and I don't want to take too much time on this because I'm sure you have many questions, and I can cover anything that deals with cyber, military technology and innovation, and the current state of the Russian conflict. And if it's not really in my wheelhouse, I'll suggest some sources that might be helpful to you to follow along. But I think one thing to remember is a lot of people are charlatans in this, in this world. A lot of people, particularly people who work in the policy community like I do, because I mainly work at the Cato Institute right now, speculate without evidence and without research. So it's good to be here. It's good to be at Iowa. It's good to be, connected to the political science department here. I see Sarah's smiling face on my list of pictures here for attendees. So hi, Dr. Mitchell. And let me start the presentation and let's just get on with it because I just updated it as of a few minutes ago. So this is fairly timely. Okay, so this should be from the beginning. Is everyone good? Everyone can see it? Yeah, I did have these pictures of the cyber bears up at ISA once, and the Russian academic on the panel was very insulted. And I think I just said something like, if a bear is going to insult you, I think we have deeper problems in our relationship. So I think I was right. But I like to have a little bit of a sense of humor here. I am going to be a bit muted today. I'm not going to be my usual effusive self. Because I was just telling the organizers that I got my 4th COVID shot yesterday because it just happened to be available and I was, downtown Alexandria. So I got it done and I don't feel bad right now. I just don't feel great. So yeah, I'm a little bit lethargic, but it's fine. This is important. And after this, I'm taking the rest of the day off. So cyber operations have become an important manifestation of political warfare. But I think one of the key questions many people have is there going to be cyber war? And I think that's a challenging proposition given the nature of cyber operations and tactics. And, a little bit of my origin story is that I started doing cybersecurity about 13 years ago. And I was invited to a conference at the Naval War College. And I thought cyber would be this new, interesting way of warfare. And everything I've learned since then has demonstrated to me that it's not a new form of warfare. It's just a continual modern manifestation of what George Keenan talked about in terms of political warfare. So with this talk, I'm going to provide a picture or portrait of how the leading cyber actor, Russia, uses the digital domain to disrupt, spy, and degrade. But I have to say that Russia does behave quite differently than many other cyber actors. But on the other hand, they don't demonstrate any greater capability or rate of success than other actors in this space. So there is a changing character of power, but there's not really a changing character of war. And I think that's something I want to unpack a little bit today. So, of course, I think something we have to refer to, of course, is the 2016 election and the information warfare campaign launched against the United States by the Russians. And it's not a political issue. This is a modern form of political warfare. It was validated by everyone in the intelligence community. They have different strengths for how much they, accepted the findings. But the difference or variation in how each intelligence operation or intelligence group accepts findings really depends on the sourcing and the methods. So the NSA really wants signals intelligence, which we didn't have a lot of, but I think it's been clear since 2016 that we had a lot of hard traditional sources in the Russian government, and we continue to have a lot of these sources given how much we've known about the invasion plan. So just as the nuclear age heralded important changes in conceptualizing the use of force to achieve political objectives, connectivity alters how rival states can seek positional relative advantage and coerce their adversaries. But I think the good news is that while Russian cyber operations are concerning, their efficacy is entirely questionable. They failed to leverage cyber operations during the 2022 war so far. And they failed in 2014 and 2008. They failed in Syria. They continue to fail. I once said they doubled down on failure. And I think we're seeing that here. But are we seeing cyber war? No. So what does Russia want? Just review where we are with the whole Russia situation. They want great power status. They want to destabilize the West. A lot of people are very much focused on NATO, but I'm not so sure NATO exactly matters that clearly, given that really Putin is seeking a return to 1994 and a return to the entirety of the Russians, the Ukrainian state, to Russian control. So they want leverage and influence. And I think it goes more to than these simple proposals that a lot of people are suggesting. This is a very deeply rooted existential crisis about Russia's assumptions about their future. And that's obviously a very deeply rooted existential crisis for the Ukrainian people. But what is Russia gaining from this war? It is not going well. They have not moved in 24 hours. Uh, a lot of people are wondering why this column of equipment is stuck outside of Kiev. And I think it's very clear the reason is twofold. One, they don't have the logistics supplies to get these people off the road. And two, it's the only safety from Turkish drones. So this is where we are in modern warfare, where Turkish drones that the Turks didn't even want to buy, they bought Russian drones. Have become a decisive factor in war, but it's not really a decisive factor of the leveraging of cyber information operations, electronic operations. All these modern frames of future warfare are just not being demonstrated here. And one of the questions is why, and hopefully I'll answer it a little bit. Russian strategies, while rival states can, as we do show, use cyber operations to compel, they're more often use the digital domain to signal, steal, and engage in covert propaganda as means of shaping long-term competition. So cyber is not a very useful tool for coercion. And a lot of people in this field have said this for a number of years. But a lot of other people are very much colored by fictions and imagination, which I don't think really has much place in warfare. I've been teaching for the US military and the Marine Corps for the last 5 years. This presentation um, was rooted in an early version I gave in 2016 at the headquarters of the US Marine Corps. So I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and I've been focused on Russian cyber operations for a long time. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are parachuting into this field and offering their perspective, which isn't exactly very useful. Shaping operations form the foundation of Russian cyber strategy. They're a deviant state in cyberspace, and they do things that other states don't do. But I think one of the problems is that the broader conjunction of propaganda efforts, espionage efforts, these actions might shape the direction of information between two opposing sides, but they do not lead to independent concessions. They do not really change the future of crisis bargaining. What do we know about Russian cyber operations? This is 2000 and 2016. I actually have a paper that's going through JAG, US government clearance right now, where we have coded over 500 cyber incidents between all parties from 2000 to 2020. I just don't have that just ready just yet. But this kind of illustrates the shape of Russian cyber operations. And I think, one thing you want to notice here that while Russia tends to leverage degrade operations more, or it's probably one of the most active states in this space, given that there is 35 overall degradation events and 11 of them are the Russians. But the great majority of Russian operations are espionage operations. And I should say that this is just kind of the types of cyber activity that we've coded and delineated, because obviously not all cyber operations are the same and they can't be necessarily compared. So you want to really cover disruption or distractions. You want to cover espionage, and we cover short and long-term espionage in our data. And we also cover degrade actions, which are seeking significant change or destruction of material and capability. So Russia is fairly active, but based on expected counts and just based on the general shape of the data, they're not all that different than other states, and they kind of tend to perform just almost as expected, if not a little bit more escalatory. And I've also written about the escalation tendencies to an Atlantic Council paper, and it's going in a book we're working on. But there is some difference to Russian operations, but not dramatically so. So what's happened in Ukraine to this point? I think to set the table, cyber campaigns in Ukraine seek to disrupt and delegitimize the country as a means of isolating Kiev and demonstrating the futility of the Russian state. There's a long history of Russian cyber attacks going back to 2014 in conjunction with the first invasion of Crimea. Parallel to kinetic operations, there was a massive DDoS attack, just as there was recently. There also was Sandworm, which was a power grid attack, and there was another power grid attack in 2015. But I think the media has gone a little bit overboard on these issues. And, one example is pretty telling in that basically the Ukrainians just went to the power substation and just flipped the power back on within 2 hours. So while Russians can impact industrial control systems and power, it's not easy. They're not very good. And just like the nature of the US electrical network, as we saw from Texas last winter, antiquated and outdated power networks are actually a strength in this space. 2017 also saw NotPetya. It was an extensive economic attack that was kind of hidden as ransomware, if I remember right. I can't exactly remember too closely right now. But it caused significant economic damage, but not really significant political damage. Which leads us to where we are right now. Oh, wait, actually, we got to do 2016 election. The CIA and FBI, NSA concluded that Kremlin operatives use cyber methods to achieve a clear objective to undermine the public faith in the democratic process. By 2015, the SVR, which is the intelligence wing of the Russian state, and also the GRU, which is the intelligence wing of the Russian army, were both conducting operations. Actually, which is funny too, is that they were conducting parallel operations, and it's pretty clear they weren't really communicating. They also targeted various state voting systems, and you might have heard some of this stuff, and they took some information from voters. But you can also, I don't know how much this will cost, but I assume it's like $200 to buy voting rules so you can send out mail. So that's exactly what they took. They didn't change any votes. They didn't get into voting systems. They just got a bunch of addresses, which is something anyone can buy. There's no evidence of a direct link between the hacks and the outcome. There was a great PNAS paper, I forget by the author, but just demonstrated that the Russians were basically speaking to echo chambers. And there's really no polls. We were asking YouGov if there were any polls from the time that demonstrated that WikiLeaks actually shaped information and perceptions of the Russian state. And there was no evidence for that. So while it was a pernicious and precarious operation, as it impacted the US state and caused a lot of us to question our democracy and our foundations of democracy, there's no evidence that it actually changed the outcome of the election. I think that's an important note to make. During the 2022 war, there was a prediction that the Ukraine conflict would redefine how we think about cyber conflict, because it will be the first time a state with real capabilities is willing to put it all on the line. That was said by Jason Healy, an adjunct researcher from Columbia. He has been attached to the Department of Homeland Security and was also instrumental in setting up one of the first cyber commands in the United States government. But I think a lot of people have unfortunately gone off a little bit on the deep end here and are making dramatic predictions that they cannot support. We have seen cyber operations. The current operations reflect attacks on trust in the Ukrainian state. There was Whispergate, a wiper posing as ransomware in mid-January. Dozens were impacted. Take that for what you will. There was a massive DDoS attack against Ukraine in mid-February. And there was a follow-on attack on February 23rd. February 23rd, Hermetic Wiper was launched. And while it's a very dangerous piece of malware, a wiper is just something that destroys your computer and wipes everything off it. All we have evidence for is multiple commercial and government organizations impacted. It's just, it doesn't sound like a lot of damage. In the meantime, the Ukrainians don't really have cyber capabilities, and they have tried to mobilize a Ukrainian IT army. You might have seen like the electronic chargers in Russia kind of say, F you Putin. There's a lot of operations that are ongoing, particularly they're targeting Belarusian trains, to the point where Belarusians couldn't pay to get on their trains the other day. But then I quipped, basically, I don't think the Russian state is paying for the train fare, so I don't know why this matters. So there is activity, but it doesn't seem to be coordinated from the Russian state. It doesn't seem to be very impactful, and it doesn't seem to be having much of an effect on the battlefield. So the Russian case offers us insights into how states fail to combine cyber operations with military instruments of power and conventional information operations. And for some people, this is shocking. But like I mentioned, I've been teaching in the military community for 5 years. We don't have a doctrine of the strategic use of cyber weapons. It's not how it works. We only have 155 cyber mission forces. So those are basically squad level operators who are capable and able to launch offensive operations, but we don't have a lot of capabilities. And the other thing is that when you work with the military, you start to realize quite quickly that they're very focused on effectiveness of operations, battle damage assessments, and being successful. And can you get promoted for a cyber operation that has no clear impact? That's really a tough question. And I see a lot of my officers dealing with that issue. Moscow tends to use cyber attacks in two ways prior to the conflict to legitimize and distract the rival, and also offer initial fighting after the initial fighting to create chaos consistent with active measures to undermine the legitimacy of the state. However, Russian cyber operations during conflict did not appear to alter outcomes and make concessions more likely. Of note, both the conflict in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 resulted in frozen conflicts, not decisive victories, and 2022 looks even more bleak. And I'm going to leave you with this tweet because a lot of us in the academic community were a bit shocked to see Jay Healy say this the other day. And I don't mean to pick on Jay Healy, but he's really put himself out in front of this idea that cyber war is a decisive factor in modern warfare. And I was being a bit snarky, and I was asking the reporters, like, you're writing these why North cyber pieces, and why are you only quoting the people who have got it wrong, or quoting the people who have an economic interest in cyberspace threats being inflated? And that would be the threat intelligence firms that make a lot of money off this. And Jay responded with two things. Is there an age gap between the academics worrying about the risks of far worse cyber conflict and those more sanguine? And I wonder if we see more war dynamic influences the pessimism, and it can all get far, far worse. So he's making two claims here. One, there's an age gap. And I pointed out below that there is an age gap. That, it's Jason Healy, it's Lucas Kelo from Oxford, and it's Ben Buchanan from Georgetown, who are the leaders on these perspectives. But on the other side, we have John Akrilla, who was the first person to articulate the idea of cyber war in the 1990s, who's my friend at the Naval War College or the Naval Postgraduate School. We have Joe Nye, who operates in the space, and we have a whole host of people that I work with and other friends in the community that have very similar perspectives. And it's not shaped by age. It's really kind of sickening to see someone kind of make a claim like, well, I know more than you. The reality is, like, I don't think a lot of people do. I've been working with the U.S. government for 5 years. I've served on a commission. Mentioned that I gave testimony to the Senate and to the UK. I've given multiple talks to the CIA, the NSA, Cyber Command. I don't know anything less than anyone else, but that's kind of a claim. But the other thing, and the more sickening thing, is this kind of, we've seen more war that influenced the pessimism. And it's basically saying that one of the reasons that people like me are not really too focused on the possibility of cyber war is that we don't have this pessimism that's rooted in seeing war. And Jay noted that he's a veteran. But I have to say that my co-author, Ben Jensen, just got back from Afghanistan for his third tour of duty. My friend Erica Bogard, or Longeren's husband, Sean Longeren, has worked with Cyber Command for years. Jackie Snyder is an Air Force reservist. There are a lot of people who are veterans who have combat experience in the space. And I think one of the things is we can't let our perceptions of fictions dominate how the real world operates and our perceptions of the real world. And I think that's what's really going on here. I would love to give a talk that says cyber's changed everything and it's a dramatic factor in warfare. My life would be so much easier if I were to do that. But that's not intellectually honest. That's not the type of research community that we want to build and have built up in this space. So while I offer something different than most people who operate in this perspective, I think it's really kind of backed up by years and years of research and coverage of this field. And Yeah, I'm excited to take your questions and happy to answer anything and talk about anything involving Russian military operations. So with that, I'll stop the presentation, but happy to keep going.
Great. Thank you very much, Brandon. We now move to the question and answer portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your viewing screen. Feel free to turn on your video function if you would like, but please keep yourself muted. While we're waiting for questions to come in, ICFRC wants to thank all of its members and donors for their support. If you would like to join ICFRC or make a gift to support our programs, please go to icfrc.org, and we thank you. To get things kicked off, we've got a couple of good questions to get to, but could you talk a little bit about the different roles in what's broadly cyber, about the different roles of information versus the kind of hacking that that breaks down software systems or things like that. So contributing to the echo chamber seems to me to be distinguishable from hacking into electric grids.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it kind of goes to one of the problems we have in this field is that some of you probably remember in the 90s, they called all this stuff information warfare. And then 9/11 happened and all the information warfare moved to the terrorism field. And then the field was reconstituted as cybersecurity. So I very much side with the history of this field, that really it's about attacks on information that really bother me the most. And I think we need to be very clear in distinguishing between leveraging digital effects on kinetic operations and leveraging digital effects on information operations and the sources of trust and foundations of modern society. And one is a lot more dangerous than the other. But on the other hand, I think we vastly overstated Russian capabilities for decades. And this idea of Russian active measures being very successful, I have not seen much evidence of that. So while information operations are dangerous and concerning, just like cyber operations, we haven't seen them really coerce. And that's a tough proposition for a lot of people to deal with. But this is where we are in the field where we need to see some effects. Otherwise, it's just, squawking and talking. So.
Okay, great. Let me get to some of our other guests or some of our other participants' questions. I wonder, what is your take on the operations by anonymous cyber group? We know that a lot of Russian websites, including the Kremlin website, have been down for several days. They threatened to steal money from Russian citizens. They threatened on March 3rd. What are the powers of cyber criminals in fighting against authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, that's a great question. One, the Russian internet's been down because the Russians have basically taken themselves offline, so they're not attacked. So it was a preemptive move. But I'm looking for this Washington Post thing we just submitted today. And I think one of the key things to note about these ransomware operations is that they tend to be not very effective because they're uncoordinated. And the other problem, of course, is that before I came on today, there was some news that possibly Anonymous has taken down Russian satellites. And all these things are well and good, especially during a massive war, but we have to be concerned with ongoing cyber operations that might lead to escalation. And attacking civilian, the economic foundations of the Russian state is probably okay. But I really worry when you have private citizens attacking the Russian government and the Russian state and how that might lead to escalation, because right now Russia is a cornered animal. And it's just my view that you don't mess with cornered animals. You don't mess with the bleeding tiger. And that's what, if Putin is a paper tiger, it's still a tiger. So, we have to be careful. So I'm really kind of concerned about these ransomware operations. But, in short, we've never seen them to be very effective. Their effects tend to be fleeting, and they're concerning for the state because they might drag us into a wider conflict.
Great, thanks. Next question is, in your view, is cyber warfare more useful for understanding terrorism than interstate war?
Not for terrorism. I just had a line in this Washington Post thing was sent in that basically remembers Cyber Command talking about ISIS operations. And they just seem to be very shocked that operations against terrorist actors did not have an impact. And it shouldn't be very shocking that when you attack a low-tech adversary, that there is little impact. And we're seeing that with Russia too, because Russia has no comms. They have no ongoing digital connectivity. Um, they're relying on Ukrainian networks, and people are speculating, well, they didn't attack Ukrainian networks because that was their plan all along. And really, I think it's akin to the U.S. government, where we talk about EABO, expeditionary base operations. And when we talk about these expeditionary base operations or these BTG kind of equivalent combat brigades, we enable them with cyber and digital communications. The Russians have not. So you can't really attack a low-tech adversary with technology. But I would say the thing that's most concerning for me and something that I've wanted to do for 5 years, and hopefully I'm getting closer and closer, is to work on cyber repression. I think that's the true cyber war. When you leverage, or state leverages cyber capabilities to attack individuals. And we've seen that with the Pegasus zero-click software. We've seen a lot of attacks on activists, on journalists, and civil society members. And to me, that's the real danger of cyber warfare, because they can't really protect themselves and they depend on digital communication. Whereas the Russians can apparently invade an entire country with no communication. So there really isn't much to fight cyber in this war right now. But for a civil society group, there's a lot to fight about, and there's a lot of concern about access. So that's my fear.
Okay, great. Can you talk about how effective the Russians have been at using social media to spread disinformation and social divisions?
Well, I think what's very clear, and it was good, GOODE on Twitter, who I hope has a paper coming out soon. But he was demonstrating that the Russians did not launch social media information operations up until mid-February. So they've known that they were going to invade at least in mid-November, and they've only started to do information operations in February. And by that time, they had already lost. And of course, Zelensky and other people have really won the information battle. So as much as we like to credit Russian active measures and their ability to manipulate social media, they have dramatically failed here. And it might even be to the point where we are very much underestimating Ukrainian failure because of the Russian failure to control the information space. So I think that's going to be something very interesting to unpack in the future, but that's kind of what we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, I evidently only like 5 other people besides Putin knew what his plans were up until, quite recently, I guess. And so no doubt the social media side of things just didn't get going until late.
And that's a problem for invasion, because you want everyone on board. I mean, in the U.S. military, it's everyone to the lieutenant colonel has a option to say something about strategy in the war game. And it's very clear the Russians did not do the same.
Yeah. What about more broadly about their use of social media, maybe going back even to 2016? How do you assess the effectiveness?
I don't think it's very effective, but on the other hand, they have had some interesting impacts. And I don't want to speculate too much, but John Mearsheimer, of course, has entered the news cycle because the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry retweeted one of his articles and said, look, it's the West's fault. But where I would suggest something's happening is that I basically live on YouTube, and all of a sudden, Mearsheimer Mearsheimer videos are being pushed on my YouTube algorithm. So I'm wondering, really, are they really trying to influence the impact of the YouTube, the TikTok, the Instagram algorithm? That's going to be something very interesting to look at in the near future. And I'm kind of excited to kind of unpack these things. And that, as devastating as war is, and as much massive suffering the Ukrainian people are going under right now, there are some positives we can take from this combat operation. And one of them is that Russian ability to control social media is much more in the imagination than in reality.
Yeah, I don't know that John Mearsheimer, who's a political science expert on international relations here in the States, whether he can really compete with the young Ukrainian woman showing everybody on TikTok how to drive a Russian tank that's been captured.
Apparently, that wasn't true either. Dresner took it down. I didn't. I didn't
Yeah,
see what happened, but I guess that's misinformation also.
yeah, but pretty pretty catchy. All right. Next question is, what can you tell us about what Russian citizens are seeing right now concerning the invasion? Do they have access to electronic sources that come from outside of Russia? China's tried to lock down internet information. How successful are the Russians at this?
There's been a lot of information that suggests that it's not even on the news in the Russian state, which is obviously concerning given the level of protests. So they've been able to suppress a lot of this information. But we'll see how this develops because the Russians came out today and said 500 people have died and nearly 3,000 have been wounded, which is probably a dramatic undercount of Russian failure. But that they're willing to admit that is a dramatic change from what they've been willing to admit in the past. Much like China during the Winter Olympics, if you're able to operate VPNs and understand how communication works, you can get all the information you want. But I don't know how much the average Russian is really uptaking this information. And I'm really excited. It's tough to say I'm excited about these things, but my friend Sam Witt and his co-author Vera do surveys in combat zones. And I'm really curious to see what we start to understand about the Russian understanding of this operation. And that's going to be really interesting. So we'll see what comes out.
Great. I'm going to read a comment from one of our participants. My personal take as a Ukrainian who is on social media, a lot of Russians have no idea about the invasion. Most of the relatives of those in the Russian army who are invading Ukraine right now have no idea where their sons are and husbands are. They believe they're doing training. And does that also accord with your sense of what's going on?
Oh yeah, and I mean, I'm forgetting the terms right now, but there's a big problem in that the Russians are coercing people to sign up for longer term military contracts. And there's a difference between a conscript and someone who signs up for conflict. And that Daily Beast was suggesting a lot of people had signed these contracts at the last minute under duress. And other people are just being sent to Ukraine with no justification for the war. So, a lot of this harkens to, one of my favorite books, All Quiet on the Western Front, when they go back to the German home front and the Germans just repeat all these, platitudes about the war. And, it's really, there's something very different going on in reality. And that's the most interesting thing about social media is the divergence between reality and our perceptions of what reality is right now. And I think a lot of people maybe are a little bit going to one extreme or the other, whether that be Russian failure or whether that be this idea that the Russians are just going to get it together any moment now and they're going to take all of Ukraine. And I think neither side is really accurate right now.
Okay. Would you care to consider the end game for the war in Ukraine?
I don't know what's going to happen right now. I know a lot of people I talk to in the policy community are very much concerned with Putin having off ramps. Putin having the ability to stop the conflict and draw down. And if we don't give him these off ramps, we're kind of leading him to more of a dramatic situation. And Josh Corser tweeted this on Twitter, but he was asking political scientists, what about this war has changed your mind? And for me, it's really the probability of nuclear strikes. And I don't mean, total nuclear warfare, but I do mean that, just as we considered in the Korean War or even a little bit in the Vietnam War, there might be this sort of reach for a tactical nuke. And that is what's very concerning and scary to me, especially if we don't give Putin the ability to leave the situation. On the other hand, though, I think a lot of us are really hoping for that dramatic palace coup, that death of Stalin moment. I don't think it's going to happen. I wish it would, but I don't really know what the end game is, and I think it's probably very concerning that I think both sides are kind of in it for the long haul right now. And I know the Ukrainians are willing to talk peace, but only if the Russians stop shelling civilian populations. Whereas the Russians are going to start shelling and keep shelling civilian populations to change the facts on the ground and take more territory as they start to negotiate with the Russians. So we're in a very bad spot right now. On one hand, the Russians are stuck. They're not moving. They're getting decimated left and right. On the other hand, they still have 150,000 troops in the country. And that's a lot of troops. I mean, it's a very big country. It's a there's a lot of Ukrainian people, but I don't know how effective it is to kind of give every grandma a hunting rifle. They need advanced weaponry.
Okay, we've got some questions that kind of take us a little farther afield to other countries. First is, how do China's cyber attack capabilities compare to US capabilities?
China is very much focused on espionage, but we've also seen a little bit of a change in that their efforts to steal information have not worked out the way they anticipated. So I think we've seen since 2018, we've seen the Chinese kind of change and shift a little bit. Their main focus is on controlling their net citizens and controlling the dynamics of protest and engagement. And Molly Roberts at San Diego and Gary King about a lot of research on this. But that's where we are really with Chinese cyber capabilities. They're very active. They're net citizens, and mobilizing millions of net citizens as proxy cyber actors is dangerous. But in terms of Chinese cyber capabilities, they're really focused on espionage, and even that's not been very successful. A side note is they took from the Persian Gulf War, the first one, that we won so easily because we had cyber power. And I think they were a little bit dismayed to realize that that wasn't the case. We had GPS, but we didn't cyber the Iraqi opposition. So that's where we are with China. They're annoying. They pester us. They steal from us constantly, but it doesn't exactly seem to give them an advantage. You would expect them to spy. The question is really how effective are they at spying? And I don't see very much effectiveness right now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll throw in that my son, who works in a company that helps build wind farms, told me that on the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, attacks on their computers, which are a kind of regular ongoing thing, jumped up tenfold from China. And I don't know if that goes to the question of how China will be supporting Russia during the course of this war. But he thought it was striking that it wasn't Russian efforts to get into their computers, it was Chinese.
It could be. I think one of the problems is that we can't really expect that we're going to see exactly where the attack is coming from in terms of internet network traffic, and that likely the best cyber operators are going to hide where they're coming from. Or maybe it's just the Chinese just don't even care anymore. But we've not seen a lot of evidence that they've been able to steal technology quite well. And every time they steal some version of the F-35 jet, they can't replicate the evidence. They can't put the things together. It's just like saying you can steal the plans for a nuclear bomb online, or you can probably go to a Reddit thread and get the plans for a nuclear bomb. Are you going to literally be able to make one? And I was very much reminded when I lived in Scotland that the Japanese were very much focused on taking Scottish whiskey and replicating it in Japan. And they were never able to do it despite the cooperation of the Scottish people. So I think this kind of mimicry of complex systems is a lot more difficult than people are really letting on. So, but we'll see how this evolves in the future.
Okay, a kind of follow-up to that has come in. Is it possible for China to hide malware in the hardware they manufacture and we buy?
It is. And actually, we are a lot better at that. We've done it multiple times. So yeah, it's possible, but one, it's very difficult. It has to take long foresight and planning. And then, in the end, you got to really think like, okay, so China takes over all the routers. What are they going to do? Like, shut down my internet? I don't. It's just the step two. I kind of call this the South Park underpants gnome problem, where they have this thing like, we're going to steal the underpants. And then the South Park kids go, and then what? And that's kind of the problem. It's like, okay, well, we're going to steal this, but or we're going to plant these back doors, and then what? Really, what we're focused on in policy is ensuring that the hardware vendors are taking security into their own hands. And right now, they kind of leave it all up to everyone else. And there's no liability because there's a lot of lawyers in this country, and there's not a lot of liability for the failure of the manufacturer. So we're really working on instituting checks and balances in the hardware itself, but it's very difficult in this American nation. And I say this working at a libertarian think tank for the government to impact the systems and processes of American manufacturers. So we'll see, but it's a precarious problem. But it kind of goes to the James Bondification of a lot of what we do in cybersecurity. And it's you can think of these dramatic ideas of doing this or that. But it's really the simple things that really kind of disrupt and they really hurt people, particularly attacks on schools, attacks on medical research. Those are the things that are way more concerning to me than this sort of strategic option of taking over American routers. And I don't know what happens then, but that's really the problem.
Okay, great. You indicated at the beginning that you might be able to share sources of other information for people. We've got a request. Where could I learn about Israeli cyber campaigns directed against the U.S. government and business entities?
Luckily, the Israeli Free Press is very active in exposing Israeli operations. Something I've noticed about the Israelis, which I think is very kind of funny in the space, is that the Americans have gone out of their way to not claim attribution for the Stuxnet attack on Iran. And the Israelis are just like, it's us, we did it, we did it all. The US wasn't even involved. So the Israelis are very active in this space and actually claiming impacts of operations. But I think really what we've seen lately, obviously, is not attacks on America, but more conventional style technological attacks on the Iranians. And of course, recently they put bombs in the concrete. They put a assassination machine guns in a car and launched it from distance. So the Israelis are doing a lot of interesting things, but it's not really cyber. So that's kind of the problem. But the Israeli, I wouldn't say population, but some of the Israeli threat actors have been very dangerous, particularly in their use of the Pegasus software that was developed by an Italian freelance company. And that's the zero-click malware. That's the thing where I think we're pretty clear that the Saudis got into Khashoggi's phone, or they got into Khashoggi's wife's phone, and that's why they knew where he was. So it's things like that that can be very dangerous. But it's also a little bit more simple in terms of just finding locations and not killing someone through some heart attack through your phone. So.
Great. Russia has been trying to establish a sovereign internet within its own borders for some time now. How does the war in Ukraine change their chances of implementing that? Will the rest of the world try to isolate Russia in terms of information flow, given the sanctions we see now?
I think it's very likely, and this is going to push this more dramatically forward. But there are significant consequences for doing this. Obviously, connecting disconnection from economic markets. There's a big debate in the crypto community because, of course, people want to punish Russia, but then a lot of people in the crypto community are like, well, this is exactly why we developed crypto, to let deviant actors actually have access to money. So it's going to be interesting in that there are consequences for Russia disconnecting itself. And that's why they've never really disconnected themselves, despite them talking about this for 15 years at this point. Because why? You're just going to disconnect yourself from the globe. And they're doing a great job of doing that right now by invading Ukraine and causing massive casualties. But there's really no great logic for it. The same thing with the Chinese. This idea of a separated and isolated internet is this fantasy, really. And all it does is take a lame goo to win a few awards and tell every Chinese person, hey, if you want to go on Instagram, get a VPN. And what's China going to do against that? It's very difficult to deal with these teenagers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, we have time for one final question, I think. What's your view of the Havana syndrome?
I have no idea. It's interesting. It's mystifying. Um, it could be akin to mass psychosis. We've seen, like, what was this, like in the 1100s when the whole French town was dancing. And I don't know. I have no idea. It's just um, it could be a really interesting microwave operation, or it could just be a lot of people who have a lot of headaches because they work in places with lead paint. I don't know. So, yeah, I'm not going to speculate, but it's fun to watch.
All right. With that, we will conclude today's program. Thanks very much to Brandon Valeriano for his excellent presentation and for sharing his expertise with us today. Brandon, I'm honored to virtually present you with the coveted ICFRC mug for tea, coffee, or the beverage of your choice. We will coordinate delivery details with you very soon. ICFRC's next program is on Tuesday, March 8th, which is also International Women's Day. And in honor of that holiday, we're excited to host Emmy Simmons from the Center for Strategic and International Affairs to speak to us about food, gender, and the challenges ahead. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are adjourned.